this bird has. And so today's talk is about uncovering some of the secret stuff about nuthatches that we might not know about. For those of you who don't know, Tall Timbers is up in North Florida. We have a portion that bleeds over into Georgia, but we've been operating since 1958 for well over 60 years at this point, studying southeastern pineland birds and southeastern ecosystems. And we are the birthplace of fire ecology. Fire was a natural component of southern pine systems, but for many years, the federal governments and others were trying to dampen enthusiasm for fire. And the station was started initially to look at the effects of fire and its importance to the ecosystems of Florida and many other places. This just shows you a shot from Pensacola many moons ago, back in the early 1900s, before the state of Florida was so heavily cut. And you can see the nice longleaf forest with the grassy understory. And this, of course, is maintained by very frequent fires that came through once every 2 to 3 years, cleared out the brush, and presented us with these wonderful, majestic pine savannas. There are 3 birds that are associated or endemic to these pinelands: the Bachman sparrow, Reconsider woodpecker, and brown-headed nuthatch. And these are all 3 limited to the range of these southern fire-maintained southern pinelands. Nuthatches, to me, is one of the more curious. Of course, spins about like an arboreal acrobat, clinging onto the branches, looking sideways, upside down. And they get their name from doing this sort of hacking motion that they do to crack seeds and also poke underneath the barks and stuff of pines. It's also one of the most curious birds. It's actually one of the few birds that uses tools. You may have a luck at some point watching one actually use a scale of a pine to pry underneath the scale of a bark of a pine tree and extract food. They're also very heavily dependent on pine seeds. And in winter, just before the pine seeds fall, they're cache the seeds, basically collecting as many seeds as they can and sticking them up underneath pine bark, again, to provide storage food for the winter months. For those you don't know, you can distinguish males from females. Males are about 5% larger, but they also have very different vocalizations. Here's a typical male vocalization. That's the common vocalizations you've heard. The female do that as well, but not quite as harsh. But this is a very distinctive female call that they give exclusively. So when you hear these little chirpy notes, that's the female calling. You can distinguish the birds very easily using these call differences. They're also primary cavity excavator, excavating a new cavity each year. Here's a male working away, excavating a cavity. I just filmed this just a couple of days ago. They'll work for 3 weeks sometimes excavating these cavities. And of course, because they are one of the primary cavity excavators, they draw a lot of attention from other species, small cavity nesters such as chickadees, titmice, eastern bluebirds in particular. Don't excavate their own cavities, but oftentimes try to usurp the nuthatch's cavity. Sometimes this can create some very dynamic situations for the nuthatch with these other species. I hope this doesn't fail. Let's see if this. Yeah. So here's an example of a very enlarged cavity that the nuthatch is excavated, and you'll watch in just a second. Suddenly, the nuthatch disappears from the screen. And what is actually here, because of some of these interactions, this eastern bluebird swoops in and grabs the male nuthatch by the nape of the neck and carries it off. So they're always kind of fighting with some of these other cavity nesting species out there, and everyone wants to use a nuthatch cavity, though. The work on tall timbers, we're about 2,200 acres of upland pines, and this gives you an idea about the extent of the work that we do. We basically find the nest all across the property and monitor the birds that are using the nest. These just show the nest distributions in 2021 and 2022. We're generally following about 120 nests each year. We band young, so we can actually watch the movement of young, the dispersal and stuff. And we use this technique called color banding. We place uniquely matched color bands on the legs of the nestlings and adults. And this way we can actually watch the birds and figure out which individuals are doing what on the landscape, how far they're moving, how long they live, and other things like that. At this point, we have over 12,000 field observations of about 2,000 birds documented over 20 years. So this is what we spend a lot of time doing. This is a young bird. You can see the light and green over dark blue, and then a red anodized band on the right leg. And so we're basically watching these birds as they sort of whittle about and do all sorts of curious things. And this bird is about to be fed by an adult who also happens to be his brother. or her brother. This is a cooperative breeding bird, just like Florida scrub jays and red-cockaded woodpeckers. Young birds often, rather than dispersing and trying to breed, they remain home with mother and father for another year and help them raise young. What's really curious to me about this is that the well-known scrub jays and red-cockadeds are so commonly referred to as cooperative breeders, but actually the nuthatch was one of the first birds for which this behavior was described. And this publication appeared in 1958, way back in the Pleistocene, as far as you guys are concerned. It didn't make any references to red-cockaded woodpeckers. It mentioned scrub jay twice, and it mentioned brown-headed nuthatches 6 when it was talking about helpers at the nest. So this bird was one of the first ones for which it was described, but yet no one has looked at this in the many, many decades since this publication appeared. And that really got me interested in wanting to do this on tall timbers, establish a long-term project. And today I'm going to talk about the cooperative breeding tendencies in the bird, testing some theory and some of the conservation work we're doing as well. Yes, you can advance. Here we go. Oops, let me go back up. So helpers in the nuthatch contribute to territory defense, and they have to excavate the cavities. They take food to the young birds. In some cases, they incubate, and they also locate food and also participate in communal roosts. They do a lot of these interactions with the adults, and they also spend a lot of time helping the parents rear young and also defending the territory from invaders. It's important to know with cooperation that it occurs in a small number of birds, only about 9% exhibit this sort of behavior. And we actually have two types of different cooperation among birds. There's what we call obligate cooperation, where a single breeding pair cannot rear young, and it's absolutely mandatory that the adults have a helper to care for the young. And then what we call conditional cooperation, where pairs can actually be successful, but some individuals help while others do not. And this actually provides you with a neat circumstance where if you can figure out what causes some individuals to help and others to decide to disperse and breed on their own, you can sort of get the factors promoting cooperation. So this is one of the things that makes the nuthatch a particularly important bird to study, because it has both young birds can try to breed on their own, but they can also help. The question about helping is date back to Darwin's day. You know, it's a big issue. Why help others? Expand your genes when you be better served by helping yourself. You're taxing yourself if you help even your mother and father a little bit to increase your genes in a population. If you just consider a couple species, both of these species live 4 years. If one of them produces from the very first time it's able to and keeps on producing, within a few more years, it'll have many more young offspring produced than a species that lives 4 years but helps for its first year and delays reproduction. So it's always been a big issue among biologists about why some species do this and how this entire system evolved. One of the factors that was thought to drive it in nuthatches, again dating back to this ancient article by Scutch, was that there was a paucity of females in the population. And the fact that there were mate shortages, it behooved some males to stay with mom and dad for a year and help and hopefully find a mate or else a vacant territory nearby. And this is called the mate limitation hypothesis, and it's been prevalent, but it's never been tested. The reason there is a female limitation in this population because they're the only individuals out there that brood the young and incubate eggs. And these nuthatches nest very low to the ground. They're basically looking at very late to stage decayed trees and snags. And this particular nest actually fledged young, but it's only about 18 inches off the ground. And this makes female particularly susceptible to snakes during the breeding season. Female survival is about 10% lower than males. And so for every 100 females in the population is 120. And this is actually a female. We captured a gray rat snake in the nest and had eaten the female and the eggs. And so it just gives you an idea about the lower factors affecting the survivorship of females. We wanted to test this actually with experimentation though. And the way that we did this was a pretty clever and neat way to do it. We can't tell you the sex of these young because they look very similar at this age, but we can pluck a feather. And I can drive it to drop the feather off at a place near Tallahassee on my way home. And I can actually have the sex determined within 24 hours for these individuals. So that's what we did. This is really literally on my way home. It's one of the only places in North America that does this type of avian sexing, but it's right on conveniently on my way home each and every day. So I'd pluck feathers, drop them off, and then the next day have the sex determined. And then we started cross-fostering young among nests. So that we produced nests that had basically all males and some nests that produced all females. And this is a way potentially to manipulate the sex ratios of the populations and have more females in some areas and many more males than normally would occur there in others. So we set this up with a portion of Tall Timbers where we tried to create a female bias on the far western reaches, and then a male bias in the southeastern corner. And to account for habitat differences, we switched that after 2 years. So 2012 and 2013, we did it one way, and then we switched it 2 years later and started switching the sex ratios in the other way. And this is a little complicated graph, but it really just shows that the experiment treatments worked very well. In the female bias plots, we ended up with 2 females for every male. And in the male bias plots, we ended up with many more males than normal for the females in the plot, a 2.5 to 1 ratio in that case, rather than the sort of 50-50 that you'd expect. Some of the effects of this particular manipulation, the groups with helpers should increase. We saw that clearly. The green dots show the male bias plots, and they had many, many more helpers, up to around 70% of the groups, rather than around 50% of the group, which is normal, had helpers. And in the female plot, the helpers were much reduced, but we also had female helpers appear in the female plot as well. The sex of the helpers basically switched in the female plots following this experiment. The number of helpers should also increase as the constraints to breeding increase as well. And we saw this as well too. This is another little tricky graph, but if you follow the blue line, in the male bias plots, we had 3 and sometimes 2 and 3 helpers, whereas in most of the other plots we had basically it was a single helper, and it max 2 helpers in some of the female bias plots for 1 year. But really we had some groups there that had 3 and sometimes 4 helpers out there that were increasing the number of helpers per group. So this gets back to too few mates available. So it's a very important reason. And this was the first test that kind of proved this mate limitation thing was actually a real thing that experimentally had proven in a population. But there's some other things that can happen too for why you want to help out. One is kinship. If you help your brother or help your dad, you could be helping yourself by transferring a portion of your genes along with them. This shows a plot for one male that hatched out in 29. The bird hatched out in this blue dot here off to the right, and basically spent his entire life within about 200 meters of where he hatched out. Over that time, he's also creating his own offspring. He helped for his first year from 29 to 2010, and he became a dominant breeder around 2012. And for the next 8 years, the next 6 years, he was breeding all throughout this area off to the west there. He was creating his offspring. And so he was in this area where he was surrounded by his male offspring as well as his male grandkids. And so these sort of situations where you have these kinship neighborhoods can also provide benefits by passing on your genes indirectly. Another reason that you can help too that we find in nuthatches is because it actually improves productivity. If you evolve up to the right there, you see 3 nuthatches pummeling this red-headed woodpecker, which is sometimes a bird that comes in and tries to snitch the young from the cavity that these birds are using. And we find, in fact, that cooperative groups have higher productivity than pairs do. So these birds also, by their cooperation, improve their nesting success and the number of offspring that they produce. We also find, curiously, that the nestlings in these cooperative groups have lower stress hormones. That is, they're fed more regularly, and they're not having to beg as much as the other nestlings are where they're tended by pairs. And these is another factor too that really makes for highly more robust, productive nestlings whenever you have a cooperative group than when you don't have them. The other thing that is, I think, really important to think about too is these nuthatches actually have all these wonderful favorable interactions. That's the best way to describe it, where they're actually out there kind of like great apes, encouraging each other. They catch food that they can each all use. They also engage in this allocreening, which is one of the more fascinating. This is a family group of 4. We see all 4 individuals sitting on this branch preening with one another. The lone individuals moves in between them, and they again, it's just like watching the social grooming that you see in great ape, except it's a very small scale. It's kind of hard to see many times with just binoculars. We'll also talk about some of our conservation work, which is very important to me. It's great to do this theoretical stuff, but I think also very important to participate in trying to make Florida a better place for all these different neat birds that we have. So this is the way nuthatch distribution just used to look like back in the day before pre-Columbian, before Florida was colonized by Europeans. It was a very extensive habitat. Nuthatches probably occurred all the way down into, we know they occurred, all the way down into South Florida, but we don't think they occurred in the Florida Keys, where there are also some pinelands, but we know that they occurred throughout this entire area, a stretch of where the pre-Columbian pinelands were in Florida. Here's the current distribution of pines in Florida, and you can see they're totally gone from a lot of places of Southeast Florida. And the nuthatch correspondingly has been eliminated from 6 counties in South Florida many, many decades ago. So from Dade up to Indian River almost is no longer found there along the southeastern coast of Florida. As part of our work we did a few years ago, we ran around the state collecting blood samples from all these different populations. We found there's a curiously distinct sort of genetic population of nuthatches. It's on the East Coast. It's not like it's a really super, it's more like there are more blue-eyed individuals there than green-eyed individuals. It's a very small difference, but it's important for conservations to try to preserve some of this genetic diversity for species like these. You're not sure what exactly good it might have, but it's also, if it doesn't take too much time to try to preserve the genetic structure there, then you can actually do some good possibly for the organism. So a few years ago, we decided that we would try to reintroduce the nuthatch. Here's who the St. Sebastian population is, and the lost populations along the Atlantic Ridge. But there's Jonathan Dickinson State Park down in Martin County, just it's about 90 miles south of where the extant population of the Atlantic Coast nuthatch gene type appears. So a big park that has a lot of potential area there. The nuthatches were last seen there sometime around 1950. So we began a relocation project for nuthatches by basically catching birds up at St. Sebastian and transporting them down to Jonathan Dickinson. We focused on juveniles because basically the juveniles are dispersing from August into October. And so what we basically did was just try to catch juveniles when they're doing this dispersal and move them down, guide their dispersal to Jonathan Dickinson State Park. And it was a pretty neat project. We would catch about 5 pairs a year and move them down to Jonathan Dickinson and just basically release them. And it worked. We now have a very first year after we did the translocation, we had nesting activity in Jonathan Dickinson, the first time it happened in over 60 years. And today we have a pretty good number of birds down there. We've estimated right now there are about 4 or 5 breeding groups at Jonathan Dickinson. We're going to continue to translocate birds for another 5 years because we really want to have as much of that genetic material from St. Sebastian transferred down to Jonathan Dickinson. And for those of you in the area, we actually have a epic phone app. If you head out to Jonathan Dickinson, you can collect information on these populations. And these crosses here just show the distribution of birds in the last census we did in early in 2023. So we think we right now have about 5 breeding groups there on the park, and are hoping to get this up and running to around 30 to 50 here in the next few years. Well, I hope I've kind of convinced you this is a pretty curious bird. It's got a lot of interesting features in it, biology tucked in behind it. And for me, it's got a lot of interesting questions. Right now, we are repeating our experiment we did, but we're also looking at some other things that could influence the behavior of groups. We're hoping to get to look at very large group sizes of birds to see how stable they are. Some of the theory out there right now suggests that if you have very extremely large helping group sizes, where you have, rather than just 1 or 2 helpers, have 3 to 4, the groups should become unstable and the productivity for groups might actually decline. And so our next experiment we're undertaking just this year is to really kind of drive those group sizes up even larger to see if this prediction actually holds out for the nuthatches. And it'd be another case where we're doing a very innovative experimental test of some of the theory out there behind the reason that birds cooperate. This is where we get to work. So the most beautiful, gorgeous places in North Florida or in anywhere in Florida. And if you're interested, we have I'll drop in the chat here in a second some of a link to some of our publications. But for this group, if you're ever interested, you could actually design a nice weekend field trip with some chaperones come up, and we have a lodge that you could stay in and explore some of the great wonders of North Florida, hit St. Mark's and do some other things. So as this group continues to grow, consider that as a field trip for yourselves at some point down the road. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and I'm going to drop in the chat here a little bit of information about tall timbers. Excuse me, a link to our webpage where you can just get some information about the Stoddard Bird Lab and the good things that we do. I was told to keep this talk to about 30 minutes. I think I've just barely beat that by about 3 minutes. So if there are any questions up there, I'll be happy to try to answer them.